The scripture reading comes from the book of Isaiah 55, 1 through 13. Come, all who are thirsty, come to the waters. You who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, or your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David. See, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a ruler and commander of the peoples. Surely you will summon nations you know not, and nations you do not know will come running to you. Because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has endowed you with splendor. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord, for he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, and I will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. You will go out you will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of thorn bush will grow juniper, and instead of briars, the myrtle will grow. This will be for the Lord's renown, for an everlasting sign that will endure forever. This week during the worship service, we're going to have a special time where we're going to be blessing prayer shawls for those who receive them in the coming year. Several ladies and also myself work constantly throughout the year to create these beautiful prayer shawls that are given to those who are in times of need, those who are in times of struggle, and those who are in a season of organ transplant, even with a group that we've partnered with. Each week, the group meets on Monday mornings just for a time of crocheting and knitting and just spending time together in fellowship. During this past week, while we were making our shawls, it came to my knowledge, somebody brought up that the library was hosting a Bible or a book study on a book called Nomad Land. The book and the subsequent movie discuss the lives of those who've turned to a transient living style called van dwelling. When you buy a van or a small mobile home and you live a transient lifestyle following the seasonal work throughout the country, many doing so in their golden years of retirement, working extremely low-paying jobs that are extremely physically demanding just to make by. Many of those who live this lifestyle have experienced violent life change following the housing bubble pop of 2008. Perhaps they lost their livelihoods as the result of outsourcing or a closing of a factory. Many other reasons, including alcoholism, having just lost their job, having gone through a divorce. Many of these factors play into the reasons that people live these lives of transience, not finding one place to dwell. Over the past year, we've seen several alarming trends in the world of economics. Ohio's minimum wage remains at $8.70 an hour, while a study at MIT suggests that a living wage in Fulton County for a two-parent household where both parents work would need to make $10.89 full-time together in order to support their household. In order for one of those parents to stay home and only one parent to work, they would need to bring home $25.86 an hour, 40 hours a week, in order to support their family. Over the last year, we've seen labor strikes flaring up in Hollywood and Nabisco, Kellogg's, John Deere. We saw an affirmative union vote in the Starbucks in Buffalo, New York. We see that Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama is going to have to host revotes after the National Labor Relations Board found that Amazon had violated labor laws and their union busting practices. Elon Musk, the current richest man in the world, at a net worth over $265 billion, would be the 46th richest country in the world. That's right, there are only 45 countries whose GDPs are higher than Elon Musk's net worth. Dozens of families in our community will have a Christmas meal this year because our church is providing it. And while I am overjoyed for our church to serve, for our church to help these families in this time, I'm kind of ashamed in a country, the richest country in the history of the world, that we have to do it. Clearly, there are many places in this world where our system is not creating joy. And so I'll ask the question I asked the ladies as we were knitting and crocheting. How does the church respond? How do we become a source of joy as we await the coming of Christ? Isaiah, as an entire book, is written in multiple sections, either 2 or 3, depending how you divide it out. And in large strokes, the first part of the book is probably written around 740 BCE, so 740 years before zero. And they include Isaiah's words of warning on the impending fall of Judah and about the coming exile following it. During this writing of the time of this, armies are coming down onto Judah. We see Israel fall, and Isaiah says, "We are next." This fall would take place in 586, 160 years later. The second and third parts kind of go together. The line separating them is a little ambiguous. And they were probably starting to be written around 538, 200 years after the first section of Isaiah was written. And later, in the 300s, about 150 to 200 years later, the two parts are brought into one in the form that we know them now. The first part describes an impending exile, Isaiah calling the people to lives of justice. And the second part recognizes that exile has happened. How do we live past exile? In today's passage, it is written to a people who are coming home for the first time in 50 years. They've been in exile. Maybe their parents or their grandparents have told them how amazing the old country was. Remember, this is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. Maybe they sat around the table around Passover and they told stories about the building of the temple. Maybe they discussed what the state of Jerusalem looked like, how beautiful of a city it was. Then as they return, they come into the city and they don't find a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. They don't find their ancestral family homes. They don't find the kingdom, or they don't find the temple built to Yahweh. They don't find a palace for their king to reside in. They find ruins. Their villages and their farmlands plundered, overgrown with thorns and briars. There is no infrastructure to support the people. And so we can guess the people start to go hungry. They start to scrounge for whatever source of sustenance they can find. I shared a couple weeks ago, even if they were to plant some fig trees, it's going to be 5 years. Fig trees go a little bit faster than apple trees. 5 years before it starts producing figs. And so in today's passage, a voice cries out, "Hey everyone, come on in." It's reminiscent of a market seller who's, "Come and get your ice cold water. Come and get your food." But the word attached to it is free. It won't cost you any money. It won't cost you any labor. It won't cost you anything. Just come and eat and feast. And the question is called out, why? Why, O Israel, do you buy things that aren't bread? Why do you spend the earnings from your labor on things that don't satiate you, that don't fill you up? Why do you waste the earnings that you've made? Now, if you have an American mindset like I do, you've probably been trained and it comes immediately to your mind, yes, poor people waste their money. Because that's how we're trained to think in our American culture. We think of Reagan's welfare queens who receive government money and then spend it on cigarettes and alcohol. But this isn't the image that the Bible is communicating here. The Bible isn't talking about poor people who spend their money frivolously. Remember that Isaiah is written in two parts, and the second part, from which we're reading today, makes lots of references to the first part, connecting the two texts, but also bringing to mind that imagery for somebody who's read the whole passage. So as we hear this call, this question of why do you spend your money in ways that don't bring you life, that don't fill you, that don't satiate you? Consider earlier Isaiah 5, beginning at verse 8. Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field until no place is left and you live alone in the land. I heard the Lord of hosts declare, surely many houses will become desolate, great mansions left unoccupied. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield but a bath of wine, very, very little wine, and an omer of seed, only an ephah of grain. What should produce 10 times as much is only producing a tenth. Woe to those who rise early in the morning in pursuit of strong drink, who linger into the evening to be inflamed by wine, who are participating in feasts. At their feasts are the lyre and the harp, tambourines and flutes and wine. They disgrace the actions of the Lord and fail to see the work of his hands. Therefore, my people will go into exile for their lack of understanding. Their dignitaries are starving, and their masses are parched with thirst. Therefore, Sheol, or the grave, enlarges its throat and opens wide its enormous jaws, and down goes Zion's nobles and masses, her revelers and carousers. And so mankind will be brought low, and each man humbled. The arrogant will lower their eyes, but the Lord of hosts will exalt by his justice, and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Lambs will graze as their own pastures, and strangers will feed in the ruins of the wealthy. These references that go back and forth between these two halves of the book of Isaiah show us that this call to spending money in ways that isn't frivolous is not about the poor. Instead, it's about the rich who continue to amass and amass and amass wealth. It's not about the failings of the poor to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Instead, it's a proclamation of God's justice being one that brings the arrogant, the rich, the too well off down low. It's a call to justice against those who seek to perpetually grow their wealth, claiming that they will lose everything. It's essential that we understand that this message, the Israelites' return to the nation, that God is offering them a dichotomy. He's offering them a second chance. Earlier in that first half of Isaiah, he is calling out the injustices that are taking place in the nation. And as they return to the nation, as they return to the ruins, God is saying, you have a second chance, an opportunity to live out the justice and righteousness I called you to in the first place. The first time they were called to justice and to share the blessings, to share the bounty of the land. And instead, the powerful hoarded it. And now the blessings are being freely given again to all. like rain or snow poured out over the land, a source of blessing for all, to give the seed growers seed and grain to the eaters. And so the question becomes, will their thoughts, not like thinking thoughts, it is thinking thoughts, but thoughts in the Hebrew communicate so much more. It's our intentions, our hopes, our dreams, our plans. Our thoughts are those things that we feel moved to do. Will those be earthly and focused on gaining power and wealth? Or will they be like God's, freely given like rain and snow over the whole of the earth, poured out on the whole of the earth to create life and sustenance? I asked Prayer Shawl, and I asked you just a moment ago, how does the church respond to stories like Nomadland? How does the church respond to the growing economic and social inequities that we see in our world? How can we proclaim that we have received joy in a world that for many is joyless? Isaiah tells us, go out in joy. Be led forth in peace. For Isaiah, being a source of joy, for being a joyful people, isn't about coming together and hoarding our own joy, even in our space. Remember, God has poured blessings into our gatherings. He's poured his Holy Spirit and his presence into our time together in worship. Do we hoard those for our 1 hour on Sunday morning? Or do we go out in joy, led forth in peace? It's then, as we're led forth, as we go out sharing that joy, as we act in joy, that we spring forth life in this world, that mountains sing. How do we proclaim joy? By being that source of joy. When we focus on doing those things that give and create life, that address iniquities and sources of injustice in our world, when we are the source of joy, we proclaim God's joy. And this is the joy of God's kingdom come. And so this week I ask, how are you going out? How are you being led forth in peace and joy, acting as a source of hope for this world in need? For our prayer shawl ministry, each and every stitch that goes into one of our prayer shawls, that goes into the little prayer squares that we have in our narthex, each and every stitch is an act of sharing joy. Now, if you knit or crochet, you know that not every stitch is a source of joy, at least not for those who are making them, but for those who receive them. Those who are often facing one of the darkest times, one of the most one of the largest trials of their lives, when they receive that prayer shawl, when they receive that act of blessing by our church, when they receive that act of blessing in every stitch. The prayer shawl ministry is an act of joy. And so, church, I challenge you. How are you an act of joy? How do you go out and address the world that God calls us to make, making God's kingdom here as it is in heaven? May it be true continually in your life and in mine.